If they can make you doubt your own heart, they never have to prove your guilt. The words echoed through Evelyn Carter's mind as she stood alone in the center of Grey Hollow Pack's council circle, surrounded by faces she had known since childhood. The crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine, wood smoke, and silent judgment. More than 100 wolves watched without a single voice raised in her defense. Their eyes refused to meet hers, as though believing the accusation was easier than questioning it. Elder Nathan stepped forward, his silver cloak shifting in the morning breeze. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made every word hurt even more. Evelyn Carter, you abandoned your own patrol and revealed our mountain trails to outsiders. By unanimous decision, this council declares you a traitor to Grey Hollow. A murmur swept across the crowd. Traitor. The word spread from one whisper to another until it became the only sound Evelyn could hear. She searched desperately for one familiar face willing to challenge it. Instead, she found Lucas Bennett, the young warrior who had once promised they would build a future together. He stood with his arms folded, refusing to look at her. His silence answered every question she still carried. Evelyn's throat tightened, but no tears came. She had spent too many nights crying alone after the patrol incident, replaying every step, every conversation, every choice. She knew she had done nothing wrong. Someone else had betrayed the pack. Someone had simply chosen her to carry the blame. I didn't do it, she said quietly. Her voice barely reached the front row. No one argued. No one asked for proof. The verdict had already become truth inside their hearts. Elder Nathan lowered his eyes. You may leave with whatever you can carry. By sunset, you will no longer belong to Grey Hollow. Belong. The word lingered longer than traitor, because losing a home hurt more than losing a title. Evelyn nodded once. She would not beg. She would not scream. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. An hour later, carrying a worn backpack, a faded green blanket, and the small compass her late father had once placed in her hand, she reached the northern ridge overlooking the endless mountain range. Behind her stood the only home she had ever known. Ahead stretched miles of untouched wilderness where snow still clung to the highest peaks even in early spring. The wind was colder there, carrying no familiar scents, no welcoming voices, only endless silence. Evelyn took one slow breath, stepped beyond the border stone, and disappeared into the mountains, unaware that far beyond the distant ridges, the Alpha King had already begun searching for a mystery no one else believed even existed. The first night nearly convinced Evelyn that the mountains would finish what her own pack had begun. The temperature dropped below freezing after sunset, and every breath drifted into the darkness like pale smoke before disappearing into the endless forest. She found shelter beneath an overhanging cliff where generations of wind had carved a shallow alcove into the granite. It was hardly a home, but it kept the worst of the icy wind away. Wrapping herself in her father's faded green blanket, she stared toward the stars and listened to the distant calls of owls echoing through the valleys. The silence was different here. It did not judge her. It did not whisper accusations. It simply existed. By morning, the mountains demanded something Grey Hollow never had. They demanded honesty. Every mistake carried consequences. Every careful choice earned another sunrise. Evelyn gathered fallen branches, learned which creeks still flowed beneath thin sheets of ice, and followed deer trails that wound through towering pines and rocky ridges. She remembered the survival lessons her father had taught her long before anyone imagined she would need them alone. Build your fire before you feel cold. Fill your canteen before you become thirsty. Respect the mountain because it never notices whether you are strong or weak. Days slowly became weeks. Her hands grew rough from splitting firewood with a worn hatchet she had carried from home. Her boots collected scratches from endless miles of uneven stone. The expensive cloak she had once worn during pack ceremonies was traded for a simple coat stitched together from discarded fabric and carefully repaired seams. Vanity disappeared long before winter did. One afternoon she discovered a small fox kit trapped beneath a fallen tree branch after a heavy storm. The frightened animal trembled as she approached, expecting another enemy. Evelyn knelt without speaking, gently lifting the branch just enough for the tiny creature to crawl free. It hesitated only for a second before disappearing into the brush, leaving behind nothing except tiny paw prints in the fresh snow. She smiled anyway, Kindness did not need witnesses to matter. As spring slowly touched the lower valleys, the mountain began revealing its quieter gifts. Wildflowers pushed through melting patches of snow. Streams swelled with clear water. Birds returned, filling each morning with songs she had never noticed while living inside crowded pack walls. For the first time in months, Evelyn no longer counted the days since her exile. She counted sunrises instead. Yet every evening as golden light slipped behind distant peaks, she still wondered who had truly betrayed Grey Hollow, and why no one had questioned the story they were given. The mystery lingered like an unanswered prayer carried by the wind. One evening, while gathering herbs along a narrow ridge nearly 2 miles from her shelter, Evelyn noticed something unusual pressed into the damp earth beside a stream. They were wolf tracks, but unlike any she had ever seen. Each print was larger than her open hand, perfectly spaced, and astonishingly fresh. Whatever had passed through these mountains was powerful, alone, and moving with quiet confidence. Her instincts whispered that she should turn back before darkness settled over the valley. Instead, curiosity pulled her one careful step farther into the trees, unaware that someone else had already begun following the same mysterious trail from the opposite side of the mountain. The trail climbed steadily through towering evergreens until the air grew cooler, and every sound seemed to disappear beneath the thick forest canopy. Evelyn moved carefully, placing each step where moss softened the rocks, her eyes never leaving the enormous paw prints pressed into the damp ground. They crossed fallen logs, shallow streams, and patches of melting snow with remarkable purpose, as though the creature that made them had never once hesitated. The farther she walked, the more she realized these were not the wandering tracks of an ordinary wolf searching for food. They belonged to something that knew exactly where it was going. A low breeze carried the scent of fresh rain mixed with pine sap, but beneath it lingered another unfamiliar scent, crisp as winter air and strangely comforting. It reminded her of cedar wood after a snowfall, powerful without being overwhelming. Her instincts urged caution, yet they did not sense danger. Instead, they whispered that she was approaching something extraordinary. As the afternoon sun slipped behind drifting clouds, she reached a narrow clearing surrounded by ancient pines whose trunks were wider than any she had ever seen. In the center lay a magnificent white wolf. Even resting on the forest floor, it looked larger than any wolf from Grey Hollow. Its thick coat shimmered beneath scattered rays of sunlight, almost glowing against the dark earth. One front leg rested awkwardly beneath its body, and its breathing rose and fell in slow, controlled rhythm. The wolf lifted its head the moment Evelyn stepped into the clearing. Brilliant silver eyes met hers across the quiet distance. There was no growl, no challenge, no fear. They simply watched one another as the forest stood perfectly still. Evelyn slowly lowered the bundle of herbs she had gathered and remained exactly where she was. She remembered what her father had once told her. Wild creatures understood calm better than courage. Without speaking, she knelt several yards away, allowing the wolf every chance to leave if it wished. Instead, it remained where it was, never breaking eye contact. Minutes passed before Evelyn noticed strands of white fur caught along rough bark nearby and faint scratches across the rocky ground, signs that the animal had slipped while crossing the steep hillside. The injury did not appear life-threatening, but it would make hunting nearly impossible. Carefully opening her satchel, she removed clean strips of cloth along with the mountain herbs she had learned could ease swelling. She placed them on a flat stone between herself and the wolf before quietly stepping back. The great animal studied the offering for a long moment. Then, to Evelyn's surprise, it rose slowly and limped toward the stone with quiet dignity. She waited until it settled again before moving closer, every heartbeat echoing in her ears. The wolf never resisted as she gently wrapped the injured leg, her hand steady despite the awe filling her chest. Up close, the creature's silver eyes held something impossible to explain. They were thoughtful, almost human, carrying a quiet intelligence that made her feel as though she was not tending a wild animal, but sharing a silent conversation with someone who understood every word she never spoke. When she finished, the wolf remained beside her for another moment before turning toward the deeper mountains. Just before disappearing among the towering pines, it looked back one final time, and for reasons Evelyn could not explain, she felt certain that this was not the last time their paths would cross. At sunrise the following morning, Evelyn returned to the clearing carrying fresh water, clean bandages, and another bundle of mountain herbs. She told herself she only wanted to make certain the magnificent white wolf had survived the night, yet deep inside she knew something stronger had drawn her back. The clearing was empty when she arrived. Only the flattened grass and a few strands of white fur remained beneath the towering pines. She smiled softly, relieved that the animal had regained enough strength to move on. As she turned to leave, she heard the faint crack of a branch somewhere uphill. Her eyes lifted instantly. Standing between two ancient cedar trees was a tall stranger dressed in a dark travel cloak dusted with bits of melting snow. His posture was calm, neither threatening nor defensive, and the morning light caught streaks of silver within his dark hair. The most striking feature, however, was his eyes. They were the exact shade of polished silver she had seen only hours before. Evelyn instinctively stepped back. Living alone in the mountains had taught her that strangers rarely wandered this deep into the wilderness without purpose. The man inclined his head politely. "I hope I did not startle you," he said in a steady voice that carried quiet confidence rather than authority. "I have been searching these mountains for something important." Evelyn tightened her grip on the leather strap of her satchel. "There is not much out here except trees, rivers, and snow." A faint smile touched his face. "Sometimes that is exactly where the most valuable things are found." His answer was unusual, but his tone remained warm enough to ease the tension in the air. He introduced himself simply as Kale, a traveler passing through the northern range. He offered nothing more, and Evelyn did not press him. She had learned that people often carried stories they were not ready to share. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered. "Are you lost?" Kale glanced toward the distant ridgeline where clouds rolled across the highest peaks. "Not anymore." The words lingered between them with quiet meaning Evelyn could not quite understand. As they walked toward the stream together, Kale noticed the bundle of herbs in her hands. "You know mountain medicine," he observed. Evelyn nodded. "Only enough to help when something is hurt." She deliberately chose the word something instead of someone. Kale looked at her with thoughtful curiosity. Most people would have walked away from an injured predator. Evelyn knelt beside the water, filling her canteen before answering. "Kindness should not depend on whether gratitude is expected." Kale remained silent for several moments. The breeze stirred the pine branches overhead, carrying the familiar scent of cedar and cold stone through the clearing. Unknown to Evelyn, he recognized another scent woven gently into the air, one he had never encountered before yet somehow felt he had been searching for across countless miles. It settled quietly in his memory without explanation. Before they parted, Kale thanked her for sharing the spring and wished her a peaceful day. Evelyn watched him disappear along the forest trail, wondering why someone who claimed to be only a traveler carried himself with the calm certainty of a man accustomed to leading others. High above the clearing, hidden beyond the trees, several distant figures silently observed the encounter. None of them dared reveal themselves, for they had just witnessed their Alpha King stop in the middle of his journey to speak with a woman the rest of the world believed had already been forgotten. Over the next several days, the mountains seemed determined to bring their paths together again. Evelyn would arrive at a stream to gather fresh water, and find Kale already repairing a small fishing line with quiet patience. She would climb a rocky overlook to collect herbs growing between the cracks, only to discover him studying the distant peaks as though he knew every valley beyond them. Neither questioned the coincidence anymore. Instead, an easy rhythm formed between them, built from shared silence more than conversation. Kale never spoke like a man trying to impress someone. He asked simple questions about the mountain flowers, the changing weather, and the wildlife that wandered through the forests. Evelyn answered without realizing how long it had been since anyone had genuinely listened to her. She explained how certain herbs thrived only after the last frost, how the streams rose nearly 2 feet after heavy spring rain, and how the hawks always circled lower before a storm arrived. Kale absorbed every word with sincere interest, as though each small detail mattered. One afternoon dark clouds gathered unexpectedly, and a cold rain swept across the ridgeline. Evelyn invited Kale to wait inside the small shelter she had built beneath the stone overhang. It was modest, barely large enough for 2 people to sit comfortably, yet everything inside reflected careful hands and quiet determination. Firewood had been stacked neatly against the dry wall. Clay cups rested beside smooth river stones. Dried herbs hung from thin cords near the entrance, filling the air with a gentle earthy fragrance. Kale looked around without speaking for several moments. Finally he smiled. Most people would call this survival. You somehow turned it into a home. Evelyn looked toward the small fire. Home is not a place that welcomes you. It is a place where you can finally breathe. Her answer lingered between them long after the rain softened outside. Kale noticed the old compass resting beside her blanket. Its brass surface had faded with age, but it had clearly been polished many times. Someone important gave that to you, he observed quietly. Evelyn traced the edge of the compass with her fingertips. My father. He always said that a compass cannot decide where you belong. It only reminds you not to lose yourself while searching. She smiled faintly before adding, I almost forgot that after everything happened. Kale lowered his eyes for a moment, as though her words reached somewhere deeply personal. He understood better than she realized. As Alpha King, countless voices constantly demanded decisions from him, yet very few people ever reminded him who he was beneath the crown. When the rain finally stopped, they stepped outside together. Fresh sunlight broke through the retreating clouds, stretching golden beams across the valley below. A small family of deer emerged cautiously from the trees, grazing peacefully only a few yards away. They showed no fear of Evelyn. Even more surprising, they did not flee from Kale either. Evelyn laughed softly. Animals usually decide what kind of person someone is long before people do. Kale glanced toward the deer, then back at Evelyn. Perhaps they see what others refuse to notice. Hidden far below the ridge, one of the royal scouts quietly lowered his spyglass. He had spent 3 days watching his king remain among the mountains instead of returning to the capital. What troubled him was not the delay. It was the expression on Kale's face. The Alpha King who inspired respect across every pack was smiling with a quiet peace his closest advisors had not witnessed in many years. All because of the woman the world had chosen to leave behind. The weather changed without warning 2 mornings later. What began as a gentle breeze quickly became a restless wind sweeping across the ridges, bending pine branches until they whispered against one another like anxious voices. Evelyn had planned to gather herbs from a sunny hillside before returning to her shelter, but dark clouds rolled over the highest peaks much faster than she expected. She spotted Kale standing near the edge of a rocky overlook, studying the distant horizon with unusual focus. We should head lower, she called. The mountain is telling us a storm is coming. Kale looked toward the sky then nodded. He trusted her judgment without hesitation. Together they started down the narrow trail, moving carefully over damp stones as the first cold drops of rain began to fall. The wind grew stronger with every passing minute, carrying loose branches across the path. A sharp crack echoed somewhere above them. Evelyn instinctively looked uphill. Several large rocks had broken free from the soaked hillside, tumbling toward the trail. This way, she called, pointing toward a small natural opening beneath a massive granite ledge she had discovered weeks earlier. They hurried across the uneven ground, reaching the shelter just as the rocks rolled harmlessly past the trail and disappeared into the valley below. The mountain grew quiet again almost as quickly as it had erupted, leaving only the steady rhythm of rain tapping against stone. Inside the shelter, both of them paused to catch their breath. Kale looked toward Evelyn with genuine admiration. You knew exactly where to go. She smiled modestly. The mountain gives warnings before it gives surprises. Most people simply forget how to listen. For a long moment neither spoke. The storm surrounded them, yet the small shelter felt strangely peaceful. A faint chill lingered in the air, and Evelyn added another piece of firewood to the flames. As the warmth slowly returned, Kale noticed a loose stone near the entrance shifting slightly under the pressure of the rainwater. Without thinking, he stepped forward to steady it so it would not block the opening. Evelyn reached out at the very same moment to help him. Their hands touched for only an instant. The world seemed to fall completely silent. The crackling fire faded. The rain became distant. A gentle warmth spread through Evelyn's fingertips, rising slowly into her chest like the first sunlight after a long winter. She looked up, startled to find Kale staring back at her with the same quiet surprise. Neither understood what had just happened, yet neither pulled away immediately. There was no fear in the moment, only a deep sense of familiarity. as though two paths that had wandered separately for years had finally crossed exactly where they were always meant to meet. The feeling passed as gently as it had arrived, leaving only racing heartbeats and unspoken questions. Cale withdrew his hand first, careful not to reveal the truth forming inside his thoughts. Among wolves, legend spoke of rare moments when destiny quietly announced itself long before words ever could. He had dismissed those stories as comforting myths. Now he was no longer certain. Evelyn looked into the fire, trying to understand why standing beside this quiet traveler felt more peaceful than every year she had spent inside her own pack. Neither of them noticed the large white wolf watching silently from the trees beyond the rain, its silver eyes fixed upon the shelter before it turned and disappeared into the mist, carrying with it the first undeniable sign that destiny had already begun moving long before either of them recognized its name. The morning after the storm, Cale was gone before sunrise. His footprints led away from the shelter and disappeared beneath a layer of fresh mountain mist, leaving Evelyn standing quietly outside with an unexpected feeling of emptiness she struggled to explain. She told herself that travelers always continued their journeys. People came and went. Mountains remained. Still, every familiar trail seemed strangely quieter without the steady sound of his footsteps beside hers. She spent the day gathering firewood and tending the small garden of mountain herbs she had planted near the stream, hoping routine would silence the questions filling her mind. Instead, the silence only made her remember every conversation they had shared, every thoughtful question, every gentle smile, every moment he had listened without judging her. As evening settled across the valley, a distant horn echoed through the mountains. Evelyn froze. That sound did not belong to hunters or wandering traders. It carried the deep, commanding note of a royal escort. Curious, she climbed a rocky overlook that faced the southern pass. Far below, a long procession moved steadily along the ancient mountain road. Riders wearing polished silver cloaks surrounded a line of dark horses, each carrying the crest of the royal pack upon embroidered banners that shifted proudly in the wind. At their center rode a figure mounted on a powerful black stallion. Even from that distance, his posture radiated quiet authority. The entire escort adjusted their pace to match his without a single spoken command. Evelyn watched until the procession disappeared beyond the trees, wondering what business could bring the royal pack so close to forgotten mountains. She never imagined she had already shared meals and conversations with the man leading them. Many miles away, inside the Grand Council chamber of the royal citadel, Cale removed the weathered travel cloak that had concealed his identity for weeks. The room fell completely silent as advisors, commanders, and royal elders stood to welcome their king. None of them spoke first. They immediately noticed something unusual. The Alpha King, who had departed with the cold focus of duty, had returned carrying an unmistakable calm that softened even the sharp lines of his expression. His chief advisor, Marcus Hale, stepped forward respectfully. "Your Majesty, we have completed the investigation concerning Grey Hollow Pack." Cale accepted the leather folder placed before him and quietly examined every report inside. Witness statements, patrol records, supply ledgers. Small details that others had overlooked now fit together with remarkable clarity. One name appeared repeatedly beside missing records, altered schedules, and contradictory testimony. It was not Evelyn Carter. She had been blamed because someone else had carefully arranged for her to stand where suspicion would naturally fall. Cale closed the folder without a word. The room remained silent, waiting for his decision. Finally he looked toward Marcus. "Prepare my escort." The advisor hesitated only briefly. "To visit Grey Hollow, Your Majesty?" Cale slowly shook his head. No, his silver eyes reflected complete certainty. "We return to the mountains first." At that same moment, Evelyn sat outside her shelter watching the first stars appear above the snow-covered peaks. She held her father's compass in one hand, turning it slowly beneath the fading light. For the first time since leaving Grey Hollow, the needle no longer reminded her of the home she had lost. Instead, it seemed to point toward a future she could not yet see, while somewhere beyond the dark ridges, the Alpha King was already riding back toward the woman whose quiet kindness had uncovered a truth that an entire pack had failed to recognize. The journey back into the mountains took less than a day, but to Evelyn it felt as though an entire season had passed since she last saw Cale. She was collecting water from the stream when familiar footsteps approached along the narrow trail. Looking up, she saw the quiet traveler standing exactly where they had first met, his dark cloak moving gently in the afternoon breeze. Relief crossed her face before she could hide it, and the small smile that followed surprised them both. "I wondered if the mountains had decided to keep you," she said softly. Kale returned the smile. "Perhaps they did." Before either could say more, the peaceful valley echoed with the sound of approaching horses. Dozens of riders emerged from the trees in perfect formation, each wearing polished silver armor that reflected the sunlight. Royal banners bearing the ancient crest of the Northern Kingdom fluttered above them. The soldiers stopped several yards away, and every rider dismounted at once. Without hesitation, they lowered their heads toward Kale. Evelyn stood completely still. Her eyes moved from the soldiers to the traveler she thought she knew, then back again. Marcus Hale stepped forward and spoke with formal respect. "Your Majesty, everything has been prepared exactly as ordered." The words settled over the clearing like falling snow. Evelyn looked at Kale in stunned silence. Memories rushed together all at once. His calm confidence. His thoughtful questions. The way every wild animal trusted him. The silver eyes she had first seen in the great white wolf. None of it had been coincidence. Kale slowly removed the simple travel cloak from his shoulders, revealing the dark royal attire beneath. Yet his expression remained exactly the same as it had beside her small campfire. There was no pride, no distance, only quiet honesty. "I wanted you to know me before you knew my title," he said gently. Evelyn lowered her eyes, trying to understand everything she had missed. "You are the Alpha King." Kale nodded once. "And you are still the same woman who offered kindness without asking who deserved it." Before she could answer, Marcus presented a sealed leather folder. Kale accepted it and turned back toward Evelyn. "The investigation is complete." He opened the folder and carefully removed several documents. "You were never responsible for betraying Grey Hollow." Evelyn's breath caught. Kale continued in the same calm voice. "Supply records were altered. Patrol routes were changed after your reports were submitted. Witnesses repeated stories they never verified for themselves. The evidence points to one of the senior patrol captains, who used your position to hide his own dealings with outsiders." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. She had imagined hearing those words countless times while living alone in the mountains, yet now that they had finally arrived, they brought unexpected peace instead of triumph. "I knew the truth would matter someday," she whispered. "I simply stopped believing anyone would search for it." Kale folded the documents and handed them to her. "The truth always matters. Sometimes it simply waits for someone willing to look beyond the easiest answer." Marcus stepped forward once more. "Grey Hollow has been ordered to assemble every elder and every witness by tomorrow morning. They will hear the findings before the entire pack." Evelyn stared at the papers resting in her hands, then looked toward the distant mountains that had become her refuge. She no longer felt like the frightened woman who had crossed the border stone carrying only a blanket and a compass. Whatever awaited her beyond those peaks, she would not return seeking acceptance from people who had abandoned her. She would return carrying the truth, and beside her stood the one man powerful enough to make an entire kingdom listen. The next morning, every wolf in Grey Hollow stood in complete silence beneath the ancient council oak as the royal escort entered the village. No one dared whisper. No one dared move. At the center of the procession rode Alpha King Kale Ashford, his presence commanding effortless respect, yet the greatest surprise came a heartbeat later. Walking beside him, dressed in the same simple mountain coat she had worn into exile, was Evelyn Carter. The same woman they had condemned now returned with quiet confidence instead of shame. Elder Nathan stepped forward, his face pale with uncertainty, while Lucas Bennett lowered his eyes, unable to meet Evelyn's gaze for the first time. Kale accepted the leather folder from Marcus Hale and addressed the gathering with calm authority. "Justice is not measured by how quickly judgment is passed. It is measured by whether truth is found." His words carried across the silent clearing. One by one, the investigation was presented. Patrol records, altered reports, false testimony repeated until it had become accepted as fact. Every piece revealed the same conclusion. Evelyn had never betrayed her pack. She had become the easiest person to blame because too few people cared enough to question the accusation. A heavy silence settled over Grey Hollow as the truth reached every heart. Elder Nathan slowly removed the ceremonial pendant from around his neck and bowed his head. "Evelyn Carter," he said quietly, "our council failed you. We judged without wisdom, and for that we ask your forgiveness." Evelyn looked across the faces that had once turned away from her. Months earlier she had imagined this moment would fill her with satisfaction. Instead she felt only peace. The mountains had already healed the part of her heart they had broken. "I accept your apology," she answered gently. "But forgiveness does not erase what happened. Let it become the reason no one else is judged without truth again." No one spoke after that. They understood the lesson better than any punishment could have taught them. Cale stepped beside Evelyn, his silver eyes warm with quiet admiration. "You crossed these mountains believing you had lost everything," he said. "Instead, you found the strength no one could ever take from you." Evelyn smiled and looked toward the distant peaks rising beyond the village. They were no longer symbols of loneliness. They were the place where she had discovered who she truly was. Cale extended his hand, not as a king giving an order, but as a man offering a future. Evelyn accepted it without hesitation. Together they turned toward the road leading north, where new beginnings waited beyond the horizon. As the morning sun climbed above the mountains, the wolves of Grey Hollow finally understood that true greatness had never been measured by power or titles. It had always been revealed through quiet courage, steadfast kindness, and the willingness to seek the truth even when the entire world chose the easier story.